Music in medieval England was a diverse and rich culture, including sacred and secular music and ranging from the popular to the elite. The sources of English secular music are much more limited than for ecclesiastical music. Medieval musicians had a wide variety of instruments available to them. These included fiddles, rebec, organ, trumpet, lute and bagpipe. Historians usually distinguish between ecclesiastical music, designed for use in church or in religious ceremonies, and secular music for use in places from royal and baronial courts, celebrations of some religious events, to public and private entertainments of the people. Because literacy and musical notation in particular were preserves of the clergy in this period, the survival of secular music is much more limited than for church music. Nevertheless, some were noted often by clergymen who had an interest in secular music. The British Isles have a long and varied history of folk music, with the first known examples dating back to the medieval period. One of the most important early figures in the development of folk music was Wat Tyler, who is credited with bringing traditional English ballads to the attention of a wider audience. In the 18th and 19th centuries, music was an important part of the lives of many people in Britain. Peasants would often gather together to sing and dance to traditional folk songs. These songs were often passed down through generations and were an important way for people to connect with their cultural heritage. In addition to traditional folk music, many people in Britain also enjoyed listening to classical music during this time period. The rise of the middle class in the 18th century led to an increase in the number of people who could afford to attend concerts and other musical performances. The evolution of popular music in Great Britain from 1900 to 1958 was marked by the rise of jazz and swing music in the 1920s and 1930s. By the 1950s, indigenous forms of British popular music were already giving way to the influence of American forms of music including jazz, swing and traditional pop, mediated through film and records. In the early 1960s, the British had developed a viable national music industry and began to produce adapted forms of American music in beat music and British blues, which would be re-exported to America by bands such as the Beatles and Rolling Stones. One of the most significant periods in popular music history was the 1950s, when rock and roll emerged as a new musical style that combined elements of rhythm and blues, country, gospel, and swing. Rock and roll was rebellious, energetic, and appealing to the young generation, especially in the United States and Britain. Some of the pioneers of rock and roll were Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, and Bill Haley. Rock and roll also influenced other genres, such as pop, soul, and doo-wop. The 1960s saw the rise of beat groups, also known as the British Invasion, that dominated the charts on both sides of the Atlantic. These groups were influenced by rock and roll, skiffle, folk, and blues, and created catchy melodies, harmonies, and lyrics. Some of the most famous beat groups were the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, the Who, and the Animals. They also experimented with new sounds and styles, such as psychedelic rock, folk rock, hard rock, and mod. The 1970s witnessed the emergence of mega-big rock bands that played in large arenas and stadiums, attracting huge crowds of fans. These bands were known for their loud, powerful, and complex sound, often featuring electric guitars, drums, keyboards, and vocals. Some of the most popular mega-big rock bands were Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, Queen, AC/DC, Aerosmith, and the Eagles. They also explored various subgenres of rock music such as progressive rock, heavy metal, glam rock, and punk rock. The 1980s and 1990s saw the diversification of popular music into many subgenres, such as new wave, synth pop, hip hop, dance, and grunge. These genres were influenced by new technologies, such as synthesizers, drum machines, and digital recording. They also reflected the social and cultural changes of the era, such as globalization. Some of the most influential artists of these decades were Michael Jackson, Madonna, Prince, U2, Nirvana, and Metallica. The advent of the internet in the late 19th and early 20th centuries had a profound impact on the popular music industry. It enabled new ways of creating, distributing, and consuming music. It also challenged the traditional business models of record labels, publishers, and retailers. The internet also facilitated the rise of online platforms such as Napster, to name but one, that had a negative effect on record sales of all bands, famous and upcoming. In hindsight, it seems that overall the internet was the final nail in the coffin for what could be called popular music, as it became less of an incentive for young bands and musicians to seek a career in music. And as if that wasn't enough for the rock star of the 20th century, then the incoming rise of artificial intelligence in the 21st century would surely see remarkable changes in human creative evolution.